healthy coral reef is truly magical. And as I mentioned when we started this journey, this entire ecosystem begins with the coral. But coral must be living in the right circumstances. And to understand, we need to go back to the coral's relationship with their zooxanthellae partners. Remember, the zoox provided up to 90% of the coral's food. And this pair generally thrives in water temperatures between 73 and 84 degrees Fahrenheit. But the problem is we don't live in an ideal world. And all of the beauty we just explored is in danger. When water temperatures rise just a small amount, and those temperatures are sustained for weeks, both corals and the zooxanthellae really stress out. And living in sustained stress causes the algae to produce too much oxygen, which becomes toxic to the coral. So if you were a coral and being poisoned by something inside of you, what would you do? You would probably do what this coral polyp is doing, spitting out its zooxanthellae. This coral is protecting itself from being poisoned, essentially, but that leaves it with another problem: starvation. And without the zooxanthellae, the corals fade or lose their color completely. And this is what we call coral bleaching. And this is a term you might have heard before. And we call it bleaching because without the zoox, you can see through the clear polyp to the white skeleton. And sustained bleaching causes corals and whole reef ecosystems to degrade. And since 1950, the world has lost about half of its shallow water coral reefs. And since 1998, there have been about 10 mass bleachings on the Great Barrier Reef. And unfortunately, they're becoming more frequent and more severe. And that's where my research comes in. I want to learn how baby corals react to stress and heat, so we can better predict what will happen to future generations of corals if temperatures continue to rise. So to do so, my team and I collect pregnant corals from the reef. Remember, I have a permit. I'm using a hammer and chisel to break off just enough to study back in the lab. And once I have my pregnant sample, I make it nice and comfy in the wet lab aquarium back on the island research station. The water comes directly from the reef, so the wet lab conditions match the local area. And now we wait and watch for the pregnant coral to release its spawn. This is an amazing time on the Great Barrier Reef in around November or December, timed with the full moon. It's known as the most synchronized sex event in the whole animal kingdom. This species of Acropora is a hermaphroditic broadcast spawner. So each polyp will release a bundle or multiple bundles of egg and sperm. And that's the genetic material that will mix with other distinct colonies that have genetic diversity to make coral babies. They essentially fertilize in the water column and develop over a few days into a coral larva. And they all spawn around the same time. And just like that, a new generation of coral enters the world. So now my colleague Andrew and I get to work. This is Professor Andrew Baird. He was my thesis advisor over 10 years ago. And now I consider him my colleague and my friend. So we were on the island together this past November. And the first thing we do after spawning is we collect those bundles from the water surface. Remember, they're positively buoyant. Then we break them apart so that we release the egg and sperm that we can separate and then refertilize, almost like coral IVF. And then I put the embryos in little vials and put them at different temperature treatments. And then I spend hours and hours watching how they grow under a microscope. I'm counting how many there are, whether they're developing abnormally, how fast they're developing. This process takes all night. And I like to joke that I have a PhD in counting. So one thing I did learn from this research was that as temperatures increase, even a small amount, more embryos developed abnormally or even died. And I learned that warming oceans are not only causing bleaching events and affecting adult corals, but it's also threatening the baby corals and therefore the ability for a coral reef to replenish their populations and recover following disturbances. And understanding this helps us make better decisions and predictions when it comes to protecting coral reefs and encouraging their recovery.